Good afternoon. Welcome to day 3 or day 2 or day 4, depending on when you count, because everyone seems to count days a little bit differently down here. I came on Monday, so it's a long week, but a good week. And thank you for sticking in. And for those of you who just came to the session because it's raining outside and you didn't want to go down to the Gaillard Center, we still thank you and welcome you. My name is Heather Staines. I'm a senior consultant with a company called Delta Think, and I'm one of the Charleston conference directors. It's my longest running conference. I've been coming since 2006, which in Charleston land still puts me as a relative newbie. So nice to meet you.
Hi, everybody. I'm Sherry Edwards, and hello to everybody over to my left. We can see you, even though it may not look like it. I'm from the University of Florida, and I'm the electronic resources librarian there. I've been in that role for about 2.5 years, and this is my first type of session at the Charleston conference, so I am very happy to be here, and I share Heather's thank you for being here. I know I didn't expect this many people, so we are reveling in this right now. Thank you.
And it's a very wide room, so we'll do our best to draw you in. This is a little bit of an experimental session. I first have to go through. We have our code of conduct. You must have seen it already. Please be respectful and inclusive towards each other. And we mostly intend for this session to be like a news broadcast, but if we do have time left at the end, we're happy to open it up to questions. We're just never sure how long we're going to get to chatting. So we'll see what happens there. So welcome to the inaugural news broadcast. This is a slide made from ChatGPT. I think I'll be a little bit sad when ChatGPT gets to the point where it can actually make the slides without the misspellings, because the misspellings are actually kind of quaint. So for now, it gives itself away with that. So why this session? As I mentioned, I'm one of the conference directors, and I have the honor of looking at the proposals when they come in, weighing in on them, recusing myself, of course, from my own proposals. But we always say, wow, so much happens between July and November. And sometimes, depending on the topic of the session, the organizers can incorporate new material, but sometimes completely new things arise. So we said, well, let's do a session that's like focusing on things that have occurred in that time span, and do it like, so Sherry and I can play a little like news anchors. And we'll see how it works. And if you guys enjoy it as a format, maybe we'll come back again, and maybe we can do some like webinars in the in-between times. So today's first feature story is Sherry's story, and I would like to invite our guest, Simon Holt, to come to the stage. It's the first time, maybe it's not the first time you've been the guest on a news program, but first time you've been a guest on a Charleston news program. So Sherry's going to lead in with the story, and then we're going to have a couple questions for Simon.
Thank you, Heather. Hello again, everybody. I am talking about today, the first news story that we have is on the American with Disabilities Act revision and regulation for Title II. This was a Department of Justice final ruling. It was published in the Federal Register on April 24th of this year. And for anybody who might not know, the Federal Register is a daily publication by the federal government of federal regulations. So the regulations basically are related to digital accessibility. So it requires state and local governments to ensure that their services and programs and other activities are accessible by people with disabilities. One of the, well, I should say the framework that the Department of Justice sanctions is something called the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. I've heard the acronym pronounced several ways. I call it WCAG. I've heard WCAG, but anyway, it's WCAG. And these are standards that focus on particular elements of accessibility, readability, audio-visual elements, non-seizure related tools or things that specifically won't cause seizures. And so these guidelines are put out by the World Wide Web Consortium, WW3C, or WW3C, yes. And that's the international benchmark for digital accessibility. So these are the things, this is the framework that state and local governments are going to implement. And again, by sanctioning of the Department of Justice. The updated regulations do have a compliance schedule. So for any entity, and I'll talk about that in a minute, but for any entity of 50,000 or more people, the compliance date is April 24th, 2026. So less than a year away. For any entity with fewer than 50,000 people, that deadline is extended by 1 year to April 24th, 2027. Truthfully, I don't know if this gets into the nitty-gritty of 50,000 versus 49,499. I imagine there are some blurred lines there depending. And the reason I say that is because there are some exceptions to these, but I'll get to that in a minute. I did want to mention that entities include places like governments, municipalities, schools, libraries, museums, and so forth. So if you read...
Just want to double check which slide I'm supposed to be on.
Oh, 2. Okay. If you read about entities, that's what that means. They're not always defined. I had to kind of go outside the regulations themselves to see, well, what does that really mean, entity? Also, the rule applies to third-party vendors, and I think this is where, well, I don't know about y'all, but I think this is where a lot of us have the bulk of our questions, because how is it that we, in these entities, can make it so that vendors comply? And that's doing business. I mean, that's the cost of doing business with vendors because these rules do apply to them as well. Any state or local entity that does business with a vendor that provides a digital platform, those vendors have to comply. Getting ahead of myself here, I think we still are all kind of in the Q&A part of that. What does this mean exactly? And I think it's a straight line with all of us kind of moving forward side by side. Probably, I'd say some people are a little more informed than others. I know that I am still asking my own questions, so really this is a description that I'm giving you more than, it's not advice, or I am certainly not a legal person. So please keep that in mind. I did mention that there are 5 exceptions. Slide 4, please.
Okay, now I'm on that side. Okay.
Thank you, that's fine.
We're winging it, folks.
Hey, experiments, you know how that goes. But I have the 5 exceptions listed on the slide here. I won't read them out loud, but what I would like to share is that these exceptions to this regulation really has to do with practicality and prioritization. And what I mean by that is not all information is going to get a whole lot of use. And so these entities have to really know, how do I, prioritize between commonly sought information versus something that really isn't commonly sought. I don't know where those exceptions land in terms of indefinite, you never have to make them accessible according to the WCAG standards. But for example, you'll see one of the, I believe it's the last one on the slide, has to do with social media posts made by these entities. Chances are very good that individual social media posts really aren't going to be heavily sought versus, say, a government document. And so these exceptions are sort of a timeline for adhering to the rules and prioritizing, as I said, commonly used information. Next slide. So on this slide, we have some responses from higher ed. I chose these because the one on the right is from Virginia Tech. The one on the left is my school, University of Florida. And these are publicly accessible web page announcements about how the school understands what these mean. I can tell you that for my part, I'm in a group at UF that is starting from the inside out. In other words, we're not really looking at things like library licenses, which is a crucial part of my role, for those of you who know about being an electronic resources librarian. But the University of Florida, being the size school that it is, for example, has a university press. And so we're starting from the inside out. What is it that the university is producing that we will need to adhere to these regulations? What are we going to need to do for those? I can't say that license terms are going to be exceptions, but I can tell you that this is how, through legal advice, that University of Florida has started down this path, just working from the inside out. Next slide. And then this is an example. It's from the webpage and then a cutout from this webpage from the state of Georgia, talking about how, no, you can't contract out what it is that needs to be done. In other words, you can't have a contract that says, oh, well, forget the regulations. We'll just worry about that. We'll right now, you and me, me, Georgia versus company B, we can do this little kind of thing and contract out what these regulations are. It does not work that way. And by the way, these are very recent pieces of information, as you can imagine, because these regulations were issued just less than a year ago. So, next slide. One thing I'd like to say, one of the themes we have for our presentation that Heather and I have are new developments. After all, this is a news show. So when I say new development, I don't mean that the regulations have been updated once again and I'm here to break the news. Oh, my goodness, could you imagine that? But what I would like to do is point out that the ARL has a blog, and there was a post, this is dated on Halloween, scarily enough. And this is ARL's recommendation for how to meet these, how librarians and libraries can, start meeting these. We do have a few slides of our sources that we used, and one of them does have this blog post that you can link to. And when you do so, you'll see on this page that you link to a PDF that the ARL recommends for steps to take. And so here, the blog writer is saying start with Born Digital. Just start there, and then move forward with that. I am still, honestly, making my way through those PDF of guidelines, but that is what it is talking about, and I'm grateful that there are large entities in our field that are actually reading the room, no pun intended, and helping us figure out how to take these steps forward. So as I mentioned, this is not in conjunction with these regulations. They are side by side with, parallel to, the Europeans with Disabilities Act. We have our guest, Simon Holt, to talk more about that. So take it away, Simon.
Sure. So I think it's worth putting both of these acts into context. Both of these acts are about empowering people with disabilities in order to get information in the same frequency, at the same time, and to the same extent as everybody else. There are over 1 billion people in the world with some kind of print impairment, and so obviously this is a sizable part of the population. I think the biggest question that I've been asked in my role, leading content accessibility at the science publisher Elsevier, is thinking about the European Accessibility Act and thinking about this Americans with Disabilities Act Title II, what are the differeces, and are the two consistent with one another? So the good news is that both of these acts are based on the WCAG Web Content Accessibility Guidelines 2.1. So that's really good because it means that we're not going to run into situations where you might be compliant with one but not compliant with the other. The two differences really are to do with scope and to do with enforcement. So in terms of scope, the European Accessibility Act is specifically about e-books and e-commerce. So it doesn't cover journals, for example. So it's about the ability to log in, find a book, learn about it, discover what accessibility features are in it, pay for the book, download the book, and read the book. So that's basically what the European Accessibility Act is about with regards to published materials. The Americans with Disabilities Act, on the other hand, is about all material that a public entity provides. So therefore it includes journals, platforms, books, and anything else that may be provided to the public by a public authority. The other main difference, apart from scope, is about responsibility and in terms of enforcement. So for the European Accessibility Act, the onus is on the publisher to provide accessible materials. And if a member of the public doesn't feel that those materials are accessible, they can complain to the regulator, so the government in the country in Europe where the book is sold. And the regulator will come to the publisher and say, you need to remediate this, and they'll give you a bit of time to do that. And if you don't do that, then you'll get a fine. In America, for the Americans with Disabilities Act Title II, the onus is on the provider, so that's the university or the hospital, the public authority. And a student can take legal action against the university if they feel that there isn't an accessible publication. And so therefore, it's on the university to agree with the publisher, and the ARL guidelines provide quite a lot of information about how universities might go about doing that, so I'm not going to get into that, to make sure that the materials that they're getting given in turn are accessible so the universities themselves can be compliant. So that's kind of the landscape here. What you have to do to satisfy both of them is basically the same, but the scope and means of enforcement and the burden of responsibility is slightly different.
Thanks, Simon, for joining us today. We know you have to rush off to another meeting, but we're happy that we had a few minutes of your time. And if anyone has questions, I can get you guys in touch, with Simon. But thanks for joining our news program today, Simon.
Thanks for having me.
Our next story is about Every Library and the Every Library Institute, and I would like to invite Kathleen McAvoy to join us on the stage. Many of you may know Kathleen. She's a longtime Charleston attendee, and when I learned that she had a new venture, I immediately wanted to learn more, and that's the impetus for what you're going to hear about today. So she's going to give a little overview, and then we're going to ask her some questions.
Yeah, I just wanted to start, first of all, put on a hat that I no longer have, because I want to make you feel a little bit better as somebody who worked a content and technology provider for nearly 18 years. I started writing about WCAG at least 10, if not 12 years ago. And the company that I worked with took up a challenge by, at the time, the Kent State University Usability Lab. And it actually increased the speed of its own resource by eliminating some of the obstructions to make it more usable. And I had the privilege of being at the Brandeis University Usability Lab as the company took people with different kinds of issues using screen readers and keyboard controls through their ideas and mock-ups to see and to gauge their impressions. So it is being done, and so I'm also saying that because Heather asked me to make sure that I included some hopeful information, and I wasn't exactly sure that I had some of my own. So I'm going to just steal some of that. So the Every Library and the Every Library Institute is the Every Library is a super PAC for libraries. As we like to say, a dark money super PAC. Go to everylibrary.org and send in some money, or ask your vendors how they're supporting libraries. Mostly in the public library and school space, protecting libraries that are up for bond issues and millages and funding issues, bringing $2 billion over the last 13 years back to libraries. And obviously in 2022, this book bans and censorship began to subsume a lot of that work. And I was, in my old role, lobbying at the state level on legislation. And so I had been working with every library, and we were a natural alliance. And I started to look at it and see what was happening at the university level. And so I was privileged to be a senior policy fellow at the Every Library Institute. So that is the 501c3 companion to the 501c4 Every Library. And we are out there every day with an incredible team, incredible partnerships, doing our best for libraries.
Next slide.
Sure. Yeah, so these are some of the examples. You can see them. Fightforthefirst.org is something you should absolutely look at. These are petition drives. You can set up alliances. We have a National Library Alliance of organizations. We sometimes are the person in between the library personnel and the legislation that might be hurting them when they can't go out there and advocate on their own. We do a lot of education, a lot of work with state libraries, a lot of work with individual libraries and organizations to help them prepare. But some of that is paid work, but a lot of this is pro bono work that is coming from funding from organizations and library supporters. And I hope you would include yourselves in that group.
Yep. So we have some questions for you, and Sherry's going to take those.
As we head into, as we wind up for 2024 and get into 2025, what can we expect based on what you've discussed?
Well, when Heather asked me for my slides, it was before November 7th, and I was thinking to myself, how do I send these slides? What am I going to send? Because we didn't know what was going to happen. And I would leave you with a few things that we see is happening. Accreditation reform. When there was a university that eliminated all its library positions in Illinois, we looked at who their accreditor was and what they said about libraries, and discovered sort of alarmingly that there was a track changes document that said in 2024 libraries were in the document in their standards, and they are not there. They're crossed out in 2025. And so really what you do, as I try to think about positively, what are you doing for accreditation? It's not just at the university level, it's at the discipline level. So how are you making that outreach? How are you getting yourselves in those conversations? How are you supporting the folks that have accreditation issues at the discipline level? You have something called the Experimental Sites Initiative that would waive laws on the basis of setting up pilot programs. And what is being discussed now is that would fund new colleges or programs with non-traditional accreditation. So if you're working with a particular large accrediting group, it might be changing because they are being asked, new accreditors, they're looking for new accrediting agencies who will hew to a more conservative or just more acceptable bent than what they're seeing now as accreditors. The second thing is the American Academy. How many of you have heard of the American Academy? One person? And that's because we have discussed it. The American Academy is right in Agenda 47. It is a plan for a national university funded mostly by the endowments of large private institutions that are not teaching the curriculum that is found to be acceptable by the incoming administration. They are planning on taxing or seizing large endowments and using that to do two things: fund the American Academy, an online university, and provide reparations for Americans who believe that they have been harmed by the censorship industrial complex. So this will be competing with existing and what they say costly four-year systems, granting degree credentials that the US government and all federal contractors will henceforth recognize. So they will be awarding degrees for completed coursework rather than teaching any classes. The third thing is you have the reauthorization of the Higher Education Act is 10 years overdue. And as a library professional, you should be in that conversation because when the Elementary School Education Act was reauthorized, actually K-12, right? During the Bush administration, which was first No Kids Left Behind, it decimated school libraries, the entire profession of school librarians. And we need to get preventative so that we are protecting ourselves and our universities from whatever is to come in this climate, from something that is, again, 10 years overdue, the reauthorization of the Higher Education Act. And then we have bills that are from test kitchens, Florida, Texas, Oklahoma, things that have been happening in other states. Stop Woke. What's the other one? That's about LGBTQ students. Don't Stay Gay. Thank you very much. Those are somebody, the head of the Democratic Party in Florida, sort of said we've been testing out some of the Project 2025 plans here in Florida, and certainly in Texas, and certainly in Oklahoma and Missouri and other states. When I was working actively in Florida, what I heard from my lobbyists, this was a few years ago, was that lobbyists from other states wanted the governor of Florida to pass certain laws to make it easier for them to pass those laws in their states. So these are some of the depressing things, not all of them certainly, or depressing, depending on your point of view, that are coming. I know you said to be hopeful.
Maybe
I mentioned
compared to the alternative that is hopeful.
Well, and you discussed or mentioned being positive about some things. So what are you optimistic about?
Yeah, I think one of the things that I would say is that I addressed before is that there are organizations out there that are agitating and advocating for libraries. And you know where you are in your own university, and you certainly have friends at other universities who may be dealing with certain things. And there is community to be had. We certainly want to be part of the solution. And I did a session last night with three academics, and they were really thinking about how to be practical, because they were both in conservative states at large state universities, and it really came down to how are you serving those folks, but also how are you demonstrating the value of the libraries. And again, I'll put the hat I no longer own on to say, how are you serving your institution? And I think a great way to do that is to use your library resources so that your presidents, provosts, department heads, the money makers at your university, the grant writers, are you including yourself in grants? Do you work on grants? Do you get any money from that? Are you working with the Office of the Research? Are you working with the grantors to make sure X% comes back to the library, that your library is named in them, that you're on your annual report, you say how many grant proposals you've brought into the university, how much money you've brought, what's your cost per student? Can you benchmark that against the universities you compete with? Because you may not be competing here, but at the university level, you are competing. So across your university, for departments of similar size, what is your cost per student? How does it compare to them? Across your university, across your state, across any organization, alliance, Big Ten, whatever group that you belong to, how do you benchmark? Across research as well. Who else is doing research in this area? And how are they supporting their libraries? Because sometimes that messaging is very important, but also, do you know your constituents at your university, your stakeholders, well enough to know how they need it to be communicated with? And do they need the business? Do they need something visual? What will resonate with them? Because just the story about how libraries are great doesn't work, right? And it's not going to work. So was that positive?
Yeah.
I think that was positive.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you,
I just wanted to check.
Thank you, Kathleen. I think Kathleen's given us a lot to think about, and hopefully not in the middle of the night. But this is just meant to sort of let you know what's happening. And Kathleen said she's happy to stick around. I'm not sure we're going to have time for questions, but you can come up to her afterwards. But
yeah, and John Schrosko, who's the executive director of Every Library and the Every Library Institute's here as well. So we're happy to talk.
Yeah. the conversation will continue. Thank you so much. So in other news, and Sherry and I had a number of what we could call like editorial or production meetings about what we'll be talking about today. And this is, and Sherry mentioned we do have a slide, a resource slide. We've tried to put the links in to these articles. I came across this article, and I forgot my note printout, so you're going to forgive me for looking over Sherry's shoulder, in a publication called Work Life, which is an HR publication about a new job, which seems to me like, in some ways, it sounds like what we used to know as corporate librarians in this instance. And so one of the things Sherry and I talked about is, does this mean maybe that the Special Libraries Association might be reinvigorated as there are more corporate librarians? But it was interesting, just some of the highlights from the article on the slide, that information professional skills stop the presses. Corporates are recognizing that they might need folks that can actually work on documents and materials. And so what did you think about the article, Sherry?
I thought it was really interesting because it prompted me to look for job ads for AI librarian. And, they're not that old. They're very recent. I found a few. I put a sample one in our bibliography that's at the end of the presentation. But I'm curious what it takes to actually be an AI librarian. What kind of education, skills, are companies looking for, and have they been there all along? And like you say, this is just sort of a repackaging of the kind of service and skill set that librarians have been offering all along, and they're just seen in a new light.
Yeah, so keep an eye on this space, and come back to us and let us know if you see something similar bubbling up. And then I came across this really, I think, particularly exciting announcement. Again, I don't have my notes, so I can't see, but Dr. Kenby Phillips is going to be, as they say, the first digital presidential library director, which sent me looking to the internet because I was sure I had seen wonderful depictions of the Obama Foundation having a physical location in Chicago, which is indeed true. But the one of the elements in this article, which is in essence, and again we have the link, was that so much of the material collected during the Obama administration was digital and born digital, that its existence sort of kind of outsized. Almost imagine like there is a physical point where some of this material may be accessed, but it's going to be broadly accessible to a much wider degree. And I really encourage you to take a look at this article. It's pretty brief, but Dr. Phillips brings very impressive credentials, of course, and her experience in, working with digital materials and underrepresented voices and the like, I think is kind of second to none.
Yes, agreed.
Agreed, yes.
Agreed.
Definitely check that out. Now, this one is maybe not so uplifting as the previous one, and some of you may have seen this. It's a Washington Post article. It is behind the paywall. But if your institution doesn't have access to, email me and I will gift you the article because I think it's so important about the state of the National Archives. And I won't read you what's on the slide for the sake of time, but Sherry, you took a look at this also, and what was your key takeaway?
Well, I'm worried because it's almost as though, how is this going to wind up? As we say here, we're, accepting only digital records now. And, with talking about digital accessibility, it just seems to me that I'm not so sure how fair that is. Some people really do better with tactile. I don't necessarily think that's a generational thing either. So I don't know how this is going to play out with the forthcoming rules and what it's going to look like and the effect it's going to have on people. I mean, that's my question. It's basically a rhetorical question. So.
Yeah, check it out. It's a really interesting article about the physical spaces at the National Archives, how some of the physical storage spaces have been repurposed for more interactive visitor activities, which of course are wonderful, and I love to visit an archive and a museum, but no longer building physical spaces to house materials. Even though I'm a big digital preservation person, that's a little bit alarming to me. And then I'll hand over to Sherry for this one.
Thank you, Heather. And as we wind up our time here, we started talking about the legal aspect of news, and so I have another one for you. As you can see, I have some points on this slide. However, I was feeling a little devilish earlier today in Starbucks, and so I decided to take a new look at the news. This is maybe 2 hours old, what I'm about to describe. And what I found is these were stories published that are not on the slide, but are actually only a day or two old. I think in one case, several hours old. We know about book bans, but we are starting to collect facts about what's going on with the book ban process. What are the impacts of these? So, school book bans tripled in 2023 and 2024. That was posted about 2 hours ago. Florida had the most book bans in the 2023-2024 school year. I believe that was in the Tallahassee Democrat. And in other sections of the country, for example, Iowa is set to finalize its school rules, no books depicting sex acts, with public comment coming on the way on December 11th. There is a pushback here, but these are all happening in such real time, I think it's almost impossible for any one newscast, experiment or not, to really keep up. So addressing what is on the slide, there are some big time publishers, namely Simon & Schuster and Random House, Penguin Random House, sorry, suing the state of Florida. It was filed on August 29th of this year by those two publishers and a few other main ones, charging that the current law of book banning in Florida violates First Amendment rights to free speech. So that is cycling through the courts. Also, there is a bill in Idaho, HB 710, House Bill 710, joined by library schools and private schools. This was in late July of this year, and they're charging that, it's pure censorship. I have to say, I was both surprised and happy to see private schools, because typically private schools kind of stay out of this stuff, is my own interpretation over the years in these contexts. So it seems like there's some commonality here among public and private schools as far as being upset about what's being taken off the shelves. I do want to add, so these are new developments. I do want to add that another new development is, I used to be a high school English teacher many years ago. And so when I was getting my degree in licensure, this was in the state of Tennessee. This was according to the No Child Left Behind Act that would make me a qualified teacher. And one of the things I learned in that experience is that it was very difficult to challenge a book and have it pulled off the shelf. You really had to go through a lot of rigor to do that. Well, that's no longer the case anymore. It's pretty easy to do that, and I consider that maybe not a development for, today, November 14th news, but trending, it just seems to be easier to do that. And I think that will be a recent new development until things change. So I did want to share, in case you were unaware, it used to be very tough, and that's just not so anymore.